Hi, everyone. It's Jennifer Sapka. I am back with another webinar. This one is talking about sensory seekers and sensory avoiders. So I am going to share my screen. I have a video that is being recorded and that you can watch at a later time. If you're not able to join now, I will upload it to my YouTube and also share it on the Sensory Scout group. I'm going to share my screen and get started. So first of all, we're going to be talking about sensory seekers and sensory avoiders, and can you be both? So before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am married with 2 grown children, and I have a 6-year-old granddaughter. I've been a pediatric OT for 36 years. And I have a YouTube channel that I started during the pandemic to help parents with some ideas. And I've uploaded some past webinars on this as well. So that you can watch those, and there are some treatment ideas on there as well. I've done hundreds of workshops for parents, therapists, and students, so I have a lot of experience doing this. And I've authored 3 books to improve the fine motor, sensory motor skills through play. Play, in my opinion, is the crux of it all, especially in kids. Hi, I just wanted to let people know that I am recording this, so if you wanted to have your video off, please do so. So the goals for today are that we understand sensory avoiding and we understand sensory seeking, that we're able to identify red flags and triggers for both, that we're aware of signs when your child may be under or overstimulated, that we understand the first steps to helping them to get to and stay in a more even state of alert, so that we get off of that roller coaster of having those swings of overstimulation and understimulation, and try and get a little more even keel. Beginning to understand how much and when to push our kids. We don't always want to avoid the meltdowns or avoid the behaviors. We want to help them be able to understand those behaviors and work through them. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding of when it's time to seek out an OT evaluation. For those of you that don't know or are new to this, maybe you haven't had exposure to OT. So what OTs do are we assist people across the lifespan, so not just pediatrics, but across the lifespan through the use of everyday meaningful activities. We'll evaluate neurological, muscular, and sensory maturation and how that affects growth. So in pediatrics, we're specifically helping to develop motor coordination, emotional maturation, and interact and participate socially across the board in their everyday life. We want you to know that sensory is the foundation of all skills. So we don't want to just teach you how to tie your shoes. We want to, if you're getting upset to have your shoes on, we want to work through that so that we can make it less of a rote skill or a Band-Aid skill, that we're really teaching or working with the whole child. So here are some quick definitions, and it'll make more sense as we go along how we're going to evaluate and decide what our child is. So sensory seekers are those kids that are seeking more information because their body is not giving them enough information. So they're hyposensitive. And then the sensory avoiders are those that are oversensitive or hypersensitive, and they're easily overwhelmed and avoiding sensory input. So as we go along, we're going to hopefully answer your question of what sensory input are we talking about. So we'll get there if that's one of your questions. Here's the next slide. So sensory integration is a technique that is used by OTs. And what it really is how we integrate the sensory information coming in. So first of all, we need to register the information, both from inside and outside the body. So what I mean by that is, like, does the air feel cold? That would be outside the body, and inside the body would be, am I hungry? Am I nervous? Am I tired? That kind of thing. Effectively process the information and then modulate a response to the input. So let me give you an example. If you are out in the woods and you're hiking and you hear a noise, so you register the input, And now you're going to process the information. Is it a bear? Is it a human? Is it a rabbit? Should I be afraid? Should I not be afraid? And then we're going to modulate that response. So if it is a bunny, I'm going to be much less fearful than if it is a grizzly bear. So we're going to take all of that information in and then have an output of whether or not we continue, or whatever our output would be, our response would be. And sometimes our kids bring in information, register the information wrongly, so then their response is overreactive or underreactive. We shouldn't just be hanging around if it is a grizzly bear. So obviously it directly affects how we attend, focus, and learn, and it could be affected by sleep, hunger, or the environment. If we're tired, all bets are off. Sleep is huge, and a really important factor for our sensory kids with sensory processing disorder. And I know that that is a challenge in and of itself. So that will be a later webinar. As I said earlier, that sensory is the foundation for all development, and it begins developing in utero. So it's something that we are born with. It's something that we all have our specific makeup for. So when there's a breakdown in how the central nervous system interprets the data, then we're no longer efficient or effective in our learning or development. And that is what we are calling a sensory processing disorder. And this is diagnosed not by an OT, but by a medical professional, a doctor. So they or a psychologist can also help you decide whether or not this is what your child has. Now, I know that a lot of kids on the spectrum also have sensory processing disorder, but it can stand alone. It can be just a sensory processing disorder. So this affects 5 to 10% of children without any diagnosis at all, and 40 to 80% with kids that have another diagnosis. And the diagnosis could be autism, it could be a neurological disorder, it could be Down syndrome, it could be CP. There are lots of other diagnoses that could coexist with sensory processing disorder. So it's often misinterpreted as bad behavior, emotional or psychological problems, but the reverse is also true. So if the child, oftentimes we see this in schools when the kids are just starting preschool or kindergarten, and it might be their first school experience, and the teacher will say, oh, I think it's just behavior. It may be, but it may not be. So we just need to delve into it a little bit more. And that's where your occupational therapist can help tease that out a little bit better. So this is a really important piece of this whole webinar, is that the sensory system, each sensory system is evaluated on a continuum from high to low. So we look at touch, taste, smell, hearing, seeing, and then there are 2 other systems that we'll get into, 3 other really, but so you're not just a sensory avoider. You can be an avoider in tactile and a seeker in proprioception. So it's not as black and white as one would think. You have to really look at each system on a continuum, okay? So these are some things that the OTs will help with if you are seeking out individual treatment for your child. And as you can see, that they have mixed patterns, so they can be over and under responsive with different sensory systems. That's what I was just explaining, that they could be over responsive for tactile and under responsive for hearing. So that is where our sensory avoiders and seekers can be both. That's how we determine that. So what we're looking for all children is that they have a sustained level of energy for a specific task, that they have enough endurance to complete a task, that they can transition smoothly between different levels of alertness. So you're going to have a different level of alertness if you are sitting in a classroom versus if you are at the playground. You want them to have a different energy level to do those activities. So we're going to increase the range of a level of arousal level. Sometimes our kids are either so high or so low. They look like they might be exhausted, or they look like they might run forever. And a lot of times our kids don't like to have that period where they are just calm and comfortable, because they're not comfortable with that, how that feels inside their body. So I have a lot of parents that will say to me, he just goes and goes and goes until he doesn't. Or that bedtime is such a struggle because they don't like that feeling of letting down and calming before you go to bed. Another thing that we work on is the range of coping strategies to help modulate that reaction and arousal. So if they're not allowed to watch TV, or if they're not allowed to go outside and play or play with a specific toy, the reaction can sometimes be monumental. So we want to help them realize that it's not as life threatening, or the response does not equal the problem. We want to increase the overall focus, attention, and organization and timing. I said this earlier too, we want to increase how the central nervous system interprets the data. That is the neurological response that the OT is going for, how in changing how the body interprets the data that's coming in, so that we know whether or not it is something we should be scared for, or something that's going to affect us physically or emotionally for that matter. Improve social interactions, play skills and flexibility and problem solving skills, and increase strength, things like motor planning and coordination, to increase a variety of play activities. So those are all things that can be affected by sensory processing disorder and can be addressed by an occupational therapist. So these are all the systems that we're going to look at individually to help you determine whether or not your child is an avoider or a seeker in each system. So touch or tactile system, gustatory is the taste system. And that includes oral processing, like are we able to move our tongue side to side to chew our food? Olfactory is smell, and smell and gustatory are very closely related. So if you walk into a room and you smell something that does not smell good, you might not want to eat it. A lot of our kids have a hard time eating in cafeterias because the smell is just not so terrific to them. So if you walk into the house, someone's baking chocolate chip cookies, it could elicit even an emotional response that would want to help us want to eat something. Auditory is hearing, visual is seeing, and also eye, hand, and eye-foot coordination. Vestibular is the sensation of movement, balance, and coordination. It is located, the vestibular tract is very closely related or in proximity, physical proximity to our auditory sense. So the hearing and the vestibular are very closely related. And we often work on those two simultaneously. Once we get more movement into our kids' system, we hear the talking coming in. So I'm sure you've heard that saying of walking and talking, how they go together. And that is why, because the systems are so closely related, physically related. Proprioception is where our body is in space. We have receptors in all of our joints, and it tells us where we are in space. It tells us how close to stand to somebody without bumping into them. It's not a cognitive thing, it's a motor thing. Our body just gives us that information. How hard to hold something like a crayon or an egg so that it doesn't break. All of that is the proprioceptive system. And interoception, which we're not really going to talk about today, but that is the sensation inside our body that tells us whether we are hungry and tired or cold or anxious, those kinds of feelings that are inside our body. Sometimes we have those kids that are not hungry and then they are starving, or they don't have to go to the bathroom and then they have to go to the bathroom immediately. So every system is unique, and every day is a different day. So it can be changed depending on if you have company coming, or if you're cooking for a lot of people and now your house smells different, or if you're preparing for a holiday and things are rearranged, or the child didn't get enough sleep. So just because one of these things wasn't the way it was yesterday doesn't mean that it's not going to be that way today. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your child is different as much as it might be a response that you're seeing for something that they haven't experienced before. Hopefully that makes sense. So sensory processing disorder doesn't mean, it just means that I learn a little differently, but it doesn't affect my cuteness. So here are some red flags. Here are some things that you should be thinking in your mind. If your child does these, it may be a red flag that your child is a sensory seeker, that they invade the personal space, that they're constantly touching people and objects, that they have an unusual pain tolerance, that you'll see a bruise on their arm and you'll say, what happened? Well, I have no idea what happened. I didn't even know I bumped into anything. That they're heavy walkers. Those are the kids that you can hear clomping down the hallway. That oftentimes my parents describe their children as daredevils. These are the kids that are jumping off the back of the couch or the top of the monkey bars. They are seeking out. I have one little, I don't know, 3-year-old who loves BMX bikes, and he is good at them and he loves to go fast. These are the kids that hug too hard or break the crayons and toys, or they hit the animal versus petting the animal, that you want them just to pet the dog or the cat nicely and they are hitting them. And they don't mean to be. It's not on purpose. It's that they don't understand their body's not giving them the feedback between the difference. These are the kids that will make loud noises or sing or hum constantly. They'll chew on foods or chew on their clothes or non-food items. And they don't seem to notice when their face is dirty or when their clothes are kind of twisted. They don't feel it on their body. And then the sensory avoiders are those that have difficulty with pedaling a bike. They might be afraid of that balance piece of it. They're scared on playground equipment or on the swing. They don't like being hung upside down. They have difficulty learning finger play songs like Itsy Bitsy Spider or Wheels on the Bus because they can't motor plan through that song. These are the kids that have poor balance and maybe some overall weakness. So standing on one foot is challenging for them. They often walk or run instead of walk because it's easier. When you walk, you have to have a lot more control. If you're walking on a balance beam, you have to have a lot more control. So oftentimes we see these kids running. They're afraid of heights. They don't like stairs or slides or being hung upside down. Swings, playgrounds are not necessarily their favorite place. They don't like to be hugged or kissed, or oftentimes they do it on their own terms. So they can hug you, but you can't necessarily hug them. They worry about people bumping into them. So often they will push people because they don't want to be pushed or they don't want to be touched. So they're just trying to keep people off of them. So that's an example of what that might look like for a behavior. Like it looks like it's a bad behavior that they're pushing kids, but what they're really trying to do is to save themselves from being bumped. They complain of pain with minimal touch. So the kid that had the bruise and didn't know how he got it, this is the other end of the spectrum where like you barely brush by them and they're like, oh my gosh, that hurt so much. So they're on the other end of that spectrum. They don't like having their hands dirty. They don't like being messy. They're easily startled by noises, and they can be picky eaters or picky about their clothing, that only a certain pair of jeans work or the material has to be soft, or a lot of my sensory avoiders do not wear jeans at all because they're kind of stiff and crunchy. Those are the words that they use to explain that. And here are some other red flags if I haven't mentioned them, but I think I kind of bumped them all in here. Another one would be the problem sleeping or not liking having their toothbrush. They don't like that feeling inside their mouth. And the foods that they eat are kind of bland because they can't always determine where the food is in their mouth. So here are signs of sensory overload. Sometimes after I've done, I'll give you a specific example. I was working with a little girl yesterday and we did the slide 4 times and I was holding her and it was slow and it was controlled. And after 4 times, she looked very, very tired. Well, it wasn't that she was sleepy. It was that it was a sensory overload. So I've had kids literally fall asleep for 5 minutes after too much input. So it's a fine line sometimes. And knowing your child is definitely going to make a difference with that. But I have crossed that line often because they're fine until they're not. Sweating, defensiveness, aggression, eyes being dilated, that shutdown or the withdrawal, vomiting, crying, fear, biting, hitting, covering ears. Those are all signs of sensory overload. So my best advice for that is that you back off and not provide any more overload by talking to them, or we just need to calm them down, put them in a spot, whether it's a certain spot in their room or maybe inside a tent where they shut out the world until they can calm their body down. And depending on the age of the child, we'll teach them different techniques. Maybe breathing is a technique, or maybe, swaddling themselves in a blanket is a technique to help reduce all of that. But it really depends on what system was being overloaded. Because if it's the auditory system, we don't want to play music. But if it's the tactile system, we might want to. If it's the tactile system, we might not want to give them a hug. So it really depends on, it's pretty specific about which system is being overloaded to help them calm that down. So this is kind of the crux. When these kinds of signs are happening on a very regular basis, that they're getting overloaded by something that you think is kind of minor, seek out an OT. They will help you figure out what system is being overloaded and how to calm your child down so that they're not constantly in that fight or flight reaction, because they're on their own roller coaster and their own internal hormones are having a hard time coming back down to homeostasis. So seek out help if you're at that point. All right, so we're going to start going through the systems, and hopefully this will help. This first system is the tactile system, and it's the largest system in the body. And we have the most receptors in our fingertips and our lips, but in 1 square inch of our hand, we have 1,000 sensory receptors. So that helps us get into our purse or our pocket and pull something out and know what it is without ever looking. So for those kids that are sensory avoiders, they are missing out on a whole lot of information from their body. They don't like to be held. They don't like to be on their tummy because they don't like the feeling on their entire body or the carpet on their hands. So we need to get in there as soon as possible to really try and help them out. They can also be sensitivity in the mouth. So it could fall under the tactile system, but inside the mouth. And this is the one that helps protect us, the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight. So if you touch a hot stove, you automatically have that fight or flight. You're going to pull your hand away. So for our kids who are having a hard time figuring out because they haven't had the input and they haven't been able to interpret it or register it or modulate it, they might not have the same response and they might keep their hand on that hot stove. So it helps protect us as well. And then we have discrimination, the light touch, the deep pressure, the vibration, temperature, pain. So the tactile system is huge and it's hugely important. So let's go for these are some red flag behaviors. So like I said, each system is going to be on a continuum. So we are going to, if you can think of a line, and on one end are the kids that are low hypersensitive, and the other end of the spectrum are the kids that are hypersensitive. Okay, so my typical example is in the States, we often carve out a pumpkin at Halloween. So I have my kids who are gagging at the sight of the pumpkin guts, and I have my other kids on the other end of the spectrum that have their hands in the pumpkin guts and literally putting it over their entire body. So those are my two ends, and somewhere in the middle is where we want them both to be. So treatment is going to be a little bit different, but the goal is going to be the same, that we want them to be somewhere in the middle. So in the low end, we have those ones, the pumpkin guts that are all over their body. They don't notice when they're messy. They touch others and objects. They have decreased awareness of pain and temperature, or they not notice when they're touched. Like if you're tapping them and saying, "Hey, Susie, it's time to go to bed," they might not even feel that. So on the other end of that, we have the kids that avoid being messy. They gag at the sight of the texture. They have difficulty standing in line. They're bothered by clothes. They don't like their teeth brushed. They don't like their hair brushed. They don't like the unexpected touch, which is why they're pushing people off so that they don't get touched. They're irritated by socks, shoes, tags, and that clothing for the temperature doesn't match. So they might want to wear long sleeves when it's really hot out because they don't like the way that it feels on their arm, because it might be like lightly brushing them. So that is the tactile system. a little funny. The taste system. This helps the ability to organize and interpret input through the mouth. It helps discriminate soft from hard. So like if you are eating soup, for example, where you have noodles and you have peas and you might have chewy meat, your mouth has to kind of discriminate all of those different textures, and it will move part of it so you can chew the meat after you swallow the liquid. So we have all of that discrimination going on inside the mouth, and it helps discriminate the sour, sweet, spicy, hot, and cold. And then obviously the same muscles that we use for eating, we use for speech, so it'll help with that musculature. And the continuum here are the kids that on the low side that stuff their mouth because they don't realize that they have too much food in there. They're not getting that input, the proprioceptive input. Mixed flavors, textures, they'll eat anything, eat very spicy food. So they're eating the hot sauce and they have no idea that it's hot, where the people on the other side are like, oh my gosh, I can barely stand that. And I want to reiterate that it's okay, right? Like everybody is different. Not everybody likes hot. Maybe it's what you grew up with. Maybe that's how your parents cooked. But as long as it's not affecting our life or changing, we can still function in life. It's okay. It's okay to have differences. Smell, and I mentioned this earlier that it's directly related to taste. That we have this thing called olfactory fatigue or adaptation, where, for example, if you put perfume on in the morning, you can no longer smell it on your own body, but someone else may be able to smell it because it's new to them. So our kids that are hypersensitive to this, we just want to make sure that we are aware of what we are wearing, what soaps, perfumes, maybe detergent that we're using. It could be affecting their sensory system. And smells also stimulate appetite. That they say for selling a house, they have specific things that you can cook that will make it more pleasant for people when they come in the house and they smell that. And here's the red flag continuum. It is for on the low end, those kids are really smelling nothing. And on the high end, those are the kids that open up the refrigerator and they can smell that something is rotting or old, that you could not smell at all. Oftentimes we have our kids smelling things before they ever put it in their mouth. They will smell not rocks. I have kids that smell rocks, everything, toys, before they ever play with it or put it in their mouth. They're easily irritated by smells and they can gag at smells. Keeping this light. The auditory system, this is the one obviously directly related to speech and vestibular. These are the kids that sometimes you're calling their name over and over and they don't listen or they don't hear you, or it takes a lot to get their attention. Auditory processing, there's lots of things that go along with this, like, for example, being able to discriminate a V versus a B. That could be an auditory processing. Or are they processing the information if you ask them to pick up the cow? Are they picking up the cow, or are they just going to look at the cow? Like they have to process that information as what you're asking them to do. And the auditory system is engaged by language, sound, and movement. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. That movement piece is hugely important when it comes to auditory. And here are some red flag behaviors. Kids cover their ears, they have speech delays, they don't respond when their name is called, they're not discriminating the sounds, they're asking you to repeat directions. They can't work with background noises. So if you have the music on or you're talking in another room or the TV is on, oftentimes these kids cannot multitask with that and they're disorganized and forgetful. The visual system. The visual system looks at acuity, perception, visual motor, visual processing, like processing how much light is needed to come in to process the information, and eye, hand, and eye foot coordination. Those all fall into the visual system. Oops, sorry. And these are our red flag behaviors. So they could have poor eye contact, poor ball skills, difficulty with puzzles, reading. They're happy to be in the dark. They have difficulty finding hidden objects or objects that have fallen on the floor. And then the high end of that are kids that sneeze in sunlight, or they'll cover their eyes from light. So some easy fixes there are a ball cap or sunglasses, something like that. So the proprioceptive system, this is a huge system for treatment. So I didn't mention it, but I'll mention it again at the end. I'm doing a follow-up webinar on August 4th at noon, same time, and it'll be treatment for both the sensory seeker and the sensory avoider. And proprioceptive is the one sense that we tap into for both. And it's hugely important, and we start there because we really want to get the muscles and the joints getting the information that they need. So I've already mentioned this as well. The receptors are in every joint, so it gives us the information that we're looking for. So for example, if you went to pick up a suitcase and you thought it was full, you would pick it up and it would go flying because it's so light. Instead of having a cognitive response of, oh, that's kind of light, I should probably put it back down and do it a second time and do it not as hard. Our joints and our muscles just adapt. There's no cognition involved. We just pick it up like, oh, it's light, and then we change our grasp and our grip without any cognition. So that is the piece that sometimes our kids are missing. Helps decide how hard or soft to touch things. This is the dog situation. I have had lots of parents say that they squeeze the dog or the baby a little too hard. They don't understand how strong they are because they're not getting that information from their joints. They have difficulty motor planning or using two sides of the brain, two hands together, crossing midline, spatial awareness, and muscle tone. So I often have kids who are playing with a ball, we're playing catch, and we are standing maybe 3 feet apart, and they whip that ball at me because they don't understand like the whole distance piece and the weight of the ball, and how heavy or how hard they should throw it based on all of those things. Knowing where their body is in space without vision, oftentimes we do tasks like jumping jacks or tying their shoes or standing on one foot without their vision, because they should still know where their body is in space and be able to complete that task without vision. So it's a little trick that you can try to see how their proprioceptive system is. So typically it's the kids on the low end that are not, the hyposensitive kids that are not getting enough information. Those are the behaviors that are glaring to us. These are the kids that do the dangerous play, the intensive play. They fall off chairs or they fall on purpose. They break crayons, they grind their teeth, they chew non-food items. They're easily tired because they're using so much energy just to do simple tasks. They're often slumped at their desk or they have a weak grasp. Those are all indicative of kids that have problems in the proprioceptive area. Vestibular is the sense of movement. These kids are also, vestibular is huge. This is the oldest sensory system. It's laid down in utero, and it feels when the mom moves in space, they're also getting some of that movement. So it is a very important system, and it can be affected by parents who are on bed rest or who have less movement for whatever reason. But the pull of gravity is affected by the vestibular system, or the vestibular system is affected by the pull of gravity. And it tells us where our head is in space. We are always looking to be back in midline. So I recently was on a boat and it kept tilting, and I keep trying to right myself up to the middle because I don't like that feeling of being off balance. Sometimes our kids have difficulty with laying down to have their diaper changed, and it's just sometimes that movement of laying them down that makes them not know where they are in space and have that fight or flight. So I mentioned this earlier as well, that the receptors are between the ears, which is why it's so closely related to the auditory system. and it helps us organize. So in therapy, we often use the vestibular system with co-working with other systems like vestibular and proprioception, or vestibular and tactile, because it is an organizing system and will help organize. There are some studies out there that show that swinging in and of itself, a 20-minute swinging, will help organize kids for some fine motor tasks or some tabletop tasks. So recess is hugely important, and our kids need to move and motor plan and figure out where their body is in space as a foundation skill. And this vestibular system is a foundation skill that we need, and it changes with age. So there are little hairs in our body, and as we get older, they get stiffer inside our ears, and it tells us that we don't want to, like, so for example, my best example is roller coasters. When you are younger, you might love them, and then as you get older, you like them less because of that movement piece. So here's the high and low for that. Those kids that can spin forever and not get dizzy at all, they are in constant motion. They're rocking, they're rolling, they're moving constantly. And on the other end of that are those kids that easily get dizzy, the ones that don't like to lay down to get their diaper changed, that they have poor balance. They don't like being upside down. They have speech delays, and they're fearful on playground equipment. They don't like having their feet off of the ground. Those are all signs of the vestibular system. So let's look at whether or not it's sensory or behavior. Typically, if it's behavior, once the child is given whatever it is they're crying about, so let's say you take a toy away or you turn off the TV, if you give that back to them and they stop crying, chances are it's behavior. Our sensory kids are crying and they get what they want back and they're still crying, and it goes on for way too long and they don't even know what they're crying about anymore, that their system is just changed so much that they can't come back to that kind of equilibrium. So oftentimes we can figure out what the trigger is, and it might be unavoidable. It might be you have to leave the house and you have to turn off the TV, and that's okay. But we can put strategies into place so that we can prepare them for this, so that it's not such a rip the Band-Aid off kind of thing. So they just don't recover the same inside, like that interoceptive piece, the hormones that are being released. That is the part that's not recovering as quickly when it's a sensory processing disorder. So sensory processing disorder might explain some of the behaviors that are happening, but it's not necessarily an excuse for bad behavior. We don't get to just pull that sensory processing card like, oh, sorry, he's got sensory processing, therefore he's got bad behavior. Those two don't actually have to go together. We can have one without the other. I just want to caution you that these sensory strategies that you're going to learn about and that you're going to try and do, and if you're already involved in OT, you're probably already doing, we don't want to take those away as a punishment. That's when our kids need the strategies, is when they're having the meltdowns. So we don't want to take them away as a punishment, like, I'm not going to give you your Chewy or your favorite toy. You want them to have that so that they can learn how to cope. We want to teach other methods, but we want to help them understand how to soothe themselves. That's hugely important. So if the sensory strategies that you try through your OT, or after August 4th, I will give you a lot of strategies. If they're not working, then it might not be a sensory problem. It might be a behavior problem. That's another way to help determine that. Here are some recommended reads. And again, this will be posted on my YouTube channel, so you can write them down then. And there's another book that I recently read called The Highly Sensitive Child, which might be something that you're interested in as well. And like I said, August 4th at noon, we'll have another webinar, and it'll be strategies how to help the seeker and the avoider. And if you have specific questions, this will give you a couple of weeks to put some ideas down, like, hey, I've noticed that my child has done this repeatedly. How can I help? Something like that. That would be very, very helpful to me. So I am going to stop sharing and stop recording.